All right, so we're now recording. Welcome back to the second week of general psychology. As I left you last week, we got to know each other and we got to explore a little bit of D2L together, and I set some of those expectations. One area that I didn't cover was packback. So within packback, I use packback in lieu of discussion posts, and I think I may have explained this last week. But I use packback as a means for us to collaborate together and kind of get a deeper understanding of some of the topics that we're covering. Generally, I think traditionally people use discussion posts. I've used those in the past and found that they get to be a little dry and uninteresting. You know, you're asking one question and you have about 35 students answering the exact same way. So about a year or two ago, I decided to try this new service, which is included in your tuition. It is free to HACS students anyway, called Packback. And what that requires us to do is to get creative with our questions. So students ask the questions, and then students will answer those questions. And we have standards that we follow for asking those questions to make sure that we're not just answering a yes or no or closed-ended questions that require very small or minimum answers. We want a little bit more depth and understanding with this. So I'm going to share my screen so everybody can see what I'm seeing. So when you log into Packback, this is the first screen that you see. Okay, it'll come up with our section, for example, general psychology, and immediately it takes you to some of the posts. Okay, now for last week, all you had to do, if you followed the directions, all you had to do was answer my question here, which it looks like I got 18 responses, so that's good. The rest of you decided to try out and try this on your own and asked your own questions. So very, very good. I'm going to maybe just pick on one of these things, but just to kind of give you a little bit of background or a little bit of backstage, you know, what I see, what comes up for me, it has your question. I can preview your post. But immediately I get to see like your curiosity points. Now I do want to highlight the importance of these curiosity posts. So I have a minimum standard of 35 for questions that you ask. So what that, and I'll show you how to maximize that in just a little bit. But if you get below that 35, you don't get full credit. And I'll explain ways that that you might get less than 35 points on that, but it's generally pretty easy to get 35 or much more points on these posts. So I'm going to use Ian as an example. Now you all can see this, so I'm not picking on Ian. So if I go into Ian, what I'm going to hopefully see for the initial post is I'm going to see an open-ended question. So what would be something that you would use to improve mood instantly? Okay, that's a good question because we're talking about introduction to psychology, and I do believe that there was mention of mood within that chapter. So that would be a valid question. It's pertinent to the topic we're covering. It's open-ended, and if we scroll down here a little bit, we would see that there's a little bit of a background as to why Ian asked this question. Okay, so great. I think this is a great post. The only thing that I would say could use an improvement is picking a source. Now it looks like Ian may have added this under the source box, which is not technically a source, but within psychology, and many of you that are going on to be professionals in the field, while we do have a value on your opinion, we do want to make sure it's as scholarly as possible. So what does that mean? That means I can have an opinion, but my opinion should be based on something that is relevant and pertinent to the field. So I would be drawing my opinion off of other sources. So I can say, for example, according to NOAA's manual for cloud cover, cirronimbus clouds are probably the tallest and most whatever, I'm using a credible source to cite why I'm asking that question or making a statement. And that's kind of what we want to do. And I'll talk more about this as we go through the course, especially when we get into your article reviews and your assignments. And you'll notice on your written assignments through the grade, I'm probably going to provide feedback. Like if you did the written assignment and you didn't add a reference at the end or in text citations, I'll give you feedback on that. So that way you can correct that for next week. I don't knock off too many points initially, but as we get through the semester, if you're not using those references, I probably will be taking more and more points off that. So just be aware of that. This week, not a big deal. We're all learning. So it might just be a point off just to get your attention. And then once you start picking up on what we need to do, then we can make them worth a little bit more points. Okay. So anyway, so that's what a decent post looks like. I'm going to move up to maybe another one here. Looks like Jacob did one as well and got 80 points for Jacob's. And as you can see here, very well written, very well written. Again, how can the shortness of life make certain things into time well spent? Okay, again, in the realm of psychology, very good narrative here. Again, and it looks like we didn't really use the citation here. So that's something you all want to pay attention to. And I'll show you where you can enter that. Okay. So some pretty good attempts so far for week one. But moving forward, like I said, we're gonna look at these in a little bit more detail. But let me go to, so each week by Wednesday, let me make sure I got my dates correct here. I don't think it is Wednesday. Bear with me. I apologize. Okay. Oops. Refresh page. I apologize. No, I don't have any instructions on there. All right, so I believe it's by Wednesday. Does anybody remember? It's either Wednesday or Thursday. It might be Thursday for your initial post.
It says Thursday on the syllabus.
Thursday.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right.
Okay, thank you. Because I have another class that it's due Wednesday, and yep, and on the syllabus it says by Thursday. Okay, so thank you for that. So by Thursday you would have your initial post. So those posts that I just showed you would be the initial one, and then by Saturday I would like you to answer, go through your peers, your classmates, and look at some of their posts and answer 2 of those. And if you do that and you get full points for it, then that's an easy 10 points each week. Okay, and that's what we'll consider as our participation grade. So in order to get in here, again, you just hit select ask new question, and what are you curious about? So for example, I can say how does let's see, is a career in psychology beneficial to the individual, for example? Okay, so that would be my question. It's open-ended. Oh no, that's actually closed-ended. Individual and how, for example. Okay, so as you can see, I got some feedback here. So great. Now if I just ask yes or no, I may not. Okay, so sometimes it won't let me. It'll moderate that question and it won't let me, because that's a yes or no question. So we don't want that. So we want something that's going to be open-ended and how. Okay. So that would be a good example of a good question. Now down here, I'll type in a paragraph or 2 as to why I'm asking that questions. According to Cicerelli, 2021, psychology, blah, 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 blah. All right. So that's, again, why am I asking this question? Why is this important to me? And why do I think somebody should answer that for me? You may know the answer, and that's okay. But we're trying to get other students to answer these questions to get them thinking about it. Okay. So down here, I noticed a couple of you had put just more narrative down here and cite your source. Okay. This is where you're going to use your APA format. Cicerelli, I think it's JW 2021 psychology and exploration. Here's let's see, I think it's 5th edition. It might be 4th edition for this class. Pearson. Okay. So that's it. Now, if you used another source, or if you used a video, or if you used something else, just go ahead and cite your source in here, and that will get you full points for this post. Okay. But like I said, up here, you're going to want about a paragraph. Once you submit, okay. So once you submit your post, it'll tell you whether it's been accepted or whether it's been moderated or what. Okay. So if it's been moderated, don't freak out. Usually it's because maybe you asked a closed-ended question, or you didn't have enough information, or you may have cut and pasted something from the book, because it does check for additional, it does check for external sources. If that happens to you, not a big deal. It's not that big of a deal. Just go ahead and redraft it and then submit it again. If it continues to happen and you just know that you're doing everything right, let me know. And then perhaps I can help you understand why it might have been moderated. Okay. But rarely does it ever get moderated. Like I said, unless there's detected plagiarism, or there isn't enough verbiage in there, or if it's a closed-end question, that's generally what happens when they get moderated. Okay. But outside of that, they should be okay to go. All right. Any questions on Packback? All right. Now, I will state that if you do not post if you don't have all of your posts by Sunday, this is one of the things, unfortunately, I can't go back and grade. So if you happen to miss a week, I think we allow you to miss a week and still get an A. However, so like, for example, say you just had a really busy week, somebody in your family was sick, you were in the hospital, or life happens, and you didn't get one of your weeks in. Don't panic. You can still get an A in this course and not and miss one of those weeks for Packback. So if you get to the end of the week, end of the semester, and you have 14. We have 14 weeks in the semester, and you got to 13, and you just want to skip the last Packback. You can do that and still get an A in this class. Okay, I kind of built in life happening within this. All right. So, any questions on Packback before we continue?
Uh,
Go ahead, Nikki. You're lit up first there.
yeah, so the Packback, you have to have a source for each for each response that you do.
For each initial post. So the response does not require one. If you want to add one, you're more than welcome to, but I don't require one for the responses, just the initial question.
The initial.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, it should be a scholarly source. So I was thinking, so like, are you going to give us like, can we use Google, or should we only use hacks books, like hacks websites?
So with scholarly items, and this is going to be built into your article review as well. What qualifies, anybody can jump in and answer this for me. What qualifies as a scholarly source?
Is it like anything with like a .org or .edu?
Those are good. Yeah, by rule of thumb, those are good ones to use. But anything that has that has been scientifically backed. Okay, so for example, if we go in and hear about a research method that somebody conducted and they don't have any sources cited, they don't have any, it hasn't been through the peer review process, which I'll talk about here today in our lecture, then it is probably not a scholarly source. Okay, like for example, Wikipedia. What is the problem with Wikipedia not being a scholarly source?
Everybody can edit it.
Right. Anybody could go in there and edit that information, which makes it not trustworthy. Now, I will say, and I encourage students to do this, if you want to use Wikipedia, go ahead. Just don't cite it. Okay. So let me clarify what I mean by that. I think Wikipedia is a great source for getting information that you might be looking up. But when you go into Wikipedia, they also have sources cited in there. So if somebody wanted to talk about research that was done, they're most likely they're going to have a little citation in there that you can follow. If you follow that and you can verify that they're talking exactly the way that about what you're looking for, and follow that source, then you can use that source. Okay, so Wikipedia is kind of a springboard, giving you the information that you want to find, giving you kind of an understanding in a language that hopefully you can understand. And then it gives you those sources in there if it's a good article. But if you follow those sources, then you can use that source as your scholarly source, if that makes sense. Okay.
And then you just want us to post the link, like where it says cite your source, like just post the link itself.
So when you cite a source, again, I kind of drive with APA here. I make sure that we're following APA. If you go, let me share my screen again. So if you go into our course, under content, and start here. Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry, course content. I have a bunch, 14 different sources here that you can use for creating an abstract, avoid plagiarism, how to write a thesis statement, preparing for a class presentation, advanced database searching. So pretty much everything that you need. Hanging indents. Okay, I'm pretty big on hanging indents there. If you selecting credible source, here's a great link on selecting a credible source. If you need to find out how to do to cite a source in APA, just follow this link. Like Purdue OWL is a great example of that. And within that, in-text citations, reference list, basic rules, this will tell you how to cite a source and list that as a reference. Okay, so it's going to take a little bit of reading, but this will get you there and give you some examples for show you some examples here. Let's see here, inverted. Let's see if it has reference authors, reference list, books. So if we want to see how to cite a book, there's a citation generator in here that'll help you do that. Some of them work, sometimes they don't. Some of them give you pop-up ads, but this is basically the format that you're going to want for just about any kind of book. So you'll have your author, you'll have your year of publication, you'll have your title, then you'll have the publisher's name, and then the DOI if it's available. So in most places, especially in Hack Library, it will be available. Okay, so that's basically the recipe you're going to use for listing your sources. Okay, does that make sense?
So that's like an example of how you want us to cite it on there.
Yep, and that would be not only within Packback, but for your assignments and your APA review or article reviews as well. Okay.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yep, go ahead.
So what happens if I have a good question and I don't find any good source for that or anything that helps to source my question?
Well, Well, again, I mean, at a minimum, your question should be pertaining to our topic in the either in the book or whatever it is that we're talking about that week, or it could be something I'm lecturing. So at a minimum, you would have your textbook available to use that as a source. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Mhm. Any other questions? Okay, all right. Nope, go
I
ahead.
just have one more question. So like, our responses have to be detailed as well. So we're asking the question and the response has to be detailed. Is
Yep.
it like, oh, does it have to be a certain number of words or?
There's no certain number of words, but it has to be at least a paragraph, I would say. So when you're answering these questions, answer it in your own experiences, answer it using a source if you want to, but I would say at least a paragraph, just to let you know.
Because I know, because the points, and because I'm confused with, like, you post something and then you get graded on points, but then how do you know, these points are given to you after the
Yeah,
post, the initial post. So how do you know what you're shooting for?
well, the first week is going to be a bit bumpy. I will say that. I mean, some of you. So with the response posts, the initial post is a no-brainer. If you do an open-ended question, a paragraph or two as to why you're asking that question, and cite your source, you're pretty much guaranteed to get at least 50 points off of that, which is above that 35. Now, if you go, so that's worth 6 points altogether. Each response is worth 2 points each, a maximum of 2 points each. If you fall short of that 35 curiosity points, you're only going to lose a point off of that. So it's not that big of a deal. And you would have feedback to know, like, for example, if you just answered yes, you probably are going to get 1 point for that. And then you would know, like, what your standard needs to be, and I would give you feedback on that, so that way maybe I need to add a couple more sentences at the end of that or something, and that would get you the full two points. So 2 points for each response post. Okay.
Okay, I get it.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Any other questions? Okay. All right. So what I'd like to do with the remaining time here is just talk about perspectives and practices within psychology, because this is going to be week 2. I know we didn't really go over too much of week 1 just because of a lack of time. So I'm going to kind of most of you did all the assignments, so I'm not going to really go backwards on this, and we'll just jump right into chapter 2 here for today. Okay. So let me share my screen. All right. So for this week, we're going to discuss perspectives and practices. And this is just going to give you a little bit of an insight as to what psychology is, what we do, what we study, and some of the important schools of thoughts behind it. Okay. So I know we did our introductions last week, but I'm a little curious as to what is your definition of psychology? When we think of psychology, what is a psychologist? What do they do? What's a classical image of a psychologist for you?
Studies behaviors.
Okay. Studies behaviors. That's definitely something we do.
I think we all kind of think
Therapist.
Okay, work as a therapist. I heard that, and somebody else.
we all kind of think of like the chair, like when somebody lays down and somebody's like talking to you.
Right. Sitting on the couch with they're not making eye contact with you, and they're behind you taking notes, right? That's kind of the classical images that we get with therapists. In reality, I mean, psychology is in many fields. I don't think. Make sure I'm sharing my screen with you. We get into marketing and advertising. We look at management. We look at even psychology has a big role in human resources, in child development, in education, in the medical field, in the mental health field. even in medicine, if we look at psychotropic medications, there's psychology in there. There's psychology in military operations, something that, when I was in the military, we had psychologists that were constantly figuring out ways to make things more efficiently. So psychology deals with the mind, and it looks at how the mind can relate to whatever important aspect we're trying to study. And it could be buying habits, it could be parenting skills, it could be learning behaviors, you name it. And psychology is behind it, because as long as it deals with people making changes or doing something, then psychology is probably the backbone for that. So that's kind of what we talked about last week. And I was asking why psychology, or how psychology played a big role for you in whatever your personal goals are, or your academic goals are, your majors are. Okay, because it really applies to just about everybody. Okay, and that's kind of what we're looking at with perspectives this week. So I like to do a little fact or myth here, or true or false. This is just to get your brains kind of queued up and start thinking psychology for the day. So I'm going to give you a question here, and if you could either give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. A thumbs up would be a true, thumbs down would be false, or if you just want to type that in chat, that would be okay with you, or with me as well. So what do you think? Psychology is a way of asking and answering questions.
True.
True. Okay. Seeing a lot of thumbs up there. Okay. All right, you're absolutely correct. Okay, when it comes to the human condition, we are always asking how we can improve things. You'll probably hear me say, and I'll reference this throughout the course. In fact, if you want to write this down or make a note of it, it might be a bonus question somewhere. But we as humans are two things. We are lazy and we are proud. Okay, those two things. And this is a theme that you're going to see that's going to come up throughout this course. And when I say the word lazy, I don't mean it demeaning. We as humans, we like things to be in routine. We enjoy things that make sense in our world, right? Because when things make sense, that requires less energy, that requires less anxiety. So we tend to do things in a way that's easy for us. So that's what I mean by lazy. When I mean proud, when I talk about humans being proud, again, we have to make sense of our world. We have to be correct. We have to be right. All right. So when you see two people arguing their point of views, we tend to see people get a little heated, right? Because they're really guarding their opinions, and that's important to them, because our opinions are really a reflection of our values and our views of the world. And if they don't make sense to us, that makes us very, very uncomfortable. So anyway, the reason I bring that up here is because we want to ask questions to make sense of our world and make things a little bit easier for us. So absolutely, this the answer to this one is true. Okay, next question I have for you. The biggest and most persistent issue in psychology concerns the nature nurture controversy. What do you think? What is the nature versus nurture controversy? Does anybody care to share with me what they think that means?
I'm pretty sure, isn't that the discussion of whether you're shaped by yourself or your environment and whatnot?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. And thank you for sharing that with me. Absolutely. So what we talk about with nature versus nurture, and I'll discuss this a little bit more, but are we born genetically with certain traits and characteristics, or do we learn them from our environment? And sometimes the answer isn't always cut and dry. We don't necessarily know if it's one or the other, or if it's both of them. So like I said, we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. All right, next question. Psychology's different perspectives contradict each other. We'll talk about perspectives in a little bit, but biological perspectives, evolutionary.
I want to say true.
Okay. Seeing most people saying true. That one is actually false. And I'll explain why when we get into this, but the perspectives don't necessarily like, we'll talk about evolutionary perspective. We'll talk about the biological perspective. We'll talk about the psychosocial perspective, but all of them are just different ways of explaining behaviors and thoughts and moods and personalities. So while they may be different, they don't necessarily contradict each other, or there's not one that's right over the other. And again, we'll get into those as we go through this lesson. All right, random assignment is fulfilled as long as you have an equal number of male and female participants. What do you think? Okay, see a thumbs down here. All right.
False.
False. Okay. Why false? Why do you think that one is false?
I don't think it matters if you have an equal number of male and female participants.
Right. And there's a couple things that are wrong. What about non-binary, right? Or what about transgender? So there are a couple things wrong with that statement. Is, first of all, equal number of male versus female. If you're studying a male population or a biological male population, then you're probably going to want to use more males than you would females, and vice versa with females, biologically born females. But again, we have different, we have transgender, we have people that identify as other than male and female. So that would not be an appropriate statement for today's standards. Now, back 50 years ago, that might have been a little bit more true. Somebody might think that, there are only two sexes, and that's what we're going to be, or two genders, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. So that's why that one is false. Okay. Last one here. Deceiving research subjects is sometimes considered ethical. What do you think? We're talking about research.
I'm not sure on this one.
Not sure on this one. It's okay if this is not a quiz. Nobody's getting a or an F or anything on this. It's just, again, to get your brains going. Seeing a lot of thumbs up here. Okay, that is actually very true, and we'll talk about that when we get into ethics of research. Because does anybody have an example of or an idea as to why that would be true?
I think maybe I'm looking at this like wrong, but I was thinking if you got a bunch of data from like, I don't know, a test, and someone doesn't fit in the normal range of data, then like you disregard it.
Okay. So like skewed results, somebody that might be an outlier. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I see where you're going with that. For this question specifically, what it's looking at. So, for example, if we bring a pool of people in, participants, to test irritability based on temperature, and we can give them a task, or we can give them like a mood test, an evaluation that determines like how irritable they are. And we don't tell them that we're testing temperature. So we just have them come in and evaluate their mood, or give them a task to see how well they perform or something. Is it going to be helpful to that individual for us to tell them that we're going to increase the temperature or decrease the temperature to see how they perform? Would that be beneficial to our research? Probably not, right? Because we'll have a couple things going on there. We're going to have self-fulfilled bias. So if we tell somebody they're going into a hot room, they might expect that they're going to be irritable, even though it's not necessarily hot in that room. Okay, so self-fulfilled prophecy. We're also going to see lower reliability for that because of maybe a placebo effect as well. So anyway, there are different reasons why we might want to slightly deceive a person in research. And like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this lesson. Okay, so nature versus nurture, as you mentioned before. What is it, right? It's looking at whether or not it's something that we're born with or something that we acquire through our environment as we develop, okay, as humans. And the example that they use here are gender differences biologically predisposed or socially constructed. What do you think? What do I mean by gender differences, do you think?
I think genders are socially constructed.
Okay, okay. How about like gender role expectations, especially? Like what traditionally, who would we expect to play with baby dolls? Boys or girls?
Girls.
Girls, right? And trucks and army men. Boys, right? So we have kind of this constructed idea in our heads that have come down, that have been passed down from generations to generations. Now there are some biological differences between boys and girls. We know that androgens make up a lot more within boys than they do girls. So we'll see more rough and tumble kind of play with boys as opposed to girls. But at what level are those socially constructed as well? So there are a lot of these questions as far as what came first. Did it come through biology, come through genes, or did it indeed come through nature? No, I'm sorry, nurture. So another example that we could probably ask is a child's grammar mostly innate or formed by experience? Okay, what do you think on that one? Nature or nurture?
I think it's formed by experience.
Okay, by experience.
Yeah, I think it's nurture.
Okay, okay. Well, and I could say it is both. All right. We are pre-programmed to pick up on sounds in our environment and learn a way to language, to pick up that language. So there is a nature component to that. And when we get into developmental psychology, we'll talk more about that. But those tools have to be available for that child in order for them to acquire language. So like, for example, feral children. So it's estimated right around the age of 7 and 9, if a child has not been exposed to any type of language or grammar nuances, then they will be almost unable to acquire them later on in life. So there is a window where they have to learn a language before that ability to learn them goes away. So we do know that there is a big nature component to that, as well as a nurture. So that's a good example. Another one here is how are differences in intelligence and personality influenced by heredity and environment? Okay, and if you look at the Minnesota twin study, we do know that intelligence does happen hereditarily. We do know that there's a predisposition to being able to adapt to one's environment. Looking at identical twins that are raised in completely separate households or different cultures or socioeconomic status, we do see intelligence form like that. But again, we would also need exposure to certain stimuli in their environment for that to also be the case, very similar to language. Okay, so we see this blending of nature versus nurture. So it's not always one or the other, but very much an integration between the two of them. Okay. Let's see, I'd like to play this video and see how, before I do, actually, I have to stop share so you can, desktop 3. Oh. Apologize. Cannot hear this.
You can't understand human nature without thinking about how humans evolved. The fact that we're products of natural selection explains some of our deepest strivings, why we love our children, why we love our spouses, why we enjoy sex, why we strive to stay alive. All of these are exactly what you'd expect as the outcome of the Darwinian process.
At the heart of Pinker's new work is an assault on a cherished conviction that has dominated intellectual life that when you were born, your mind was a blank slate, and your character formed by the culture you live in.
The blank slate refers to the idea that the mind has no inherent structure, that babies are born without any talents or abilities, and that the entire mind and personality is a product of the environment, of socialization by parents, and of absorption of values from the culture.
The blank slate is immensely pervasive in the social sciences that still react in a sort of emotional, almost hysterical way to the idea that genes have anything to do with those aspects of human behavior which are of sort of social interest. Yes, it's very pervasive.
Why has the idea that your human nature is sculpted from nurture rather than nature carried such weight?
Well, there are some politically and morally attractive features of the doctrine of the blank slate. If all of us are born with nothing, that means that all of us are by definition equal, and there's no room a priori for some people or one sex or one race to be smarter or faster or healthier or more conscientious or than any other. If we're all blank slates, then by definition we're all equal.
And the blank slate was not merely a laudable liberal aim. It was also a reaction to the dark heart of a century.
Part of the appeal of the blank slate is that the opposite view, the idea that there's a biological constitution to humans, was horrendously perverted in the late 19th and early decades of the 20th century. In eugenics, the desire to reshape humans by biological means. In social Darwinism, the idea that the upper classes or dominant nations deserve their success and were carrying out the wisdom of nature, and that the downtrodden and the poor were being eliminated as part of the process of survival.
Okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Just wanted to make sure that my microphone didn't turn off. I stopped that halfway through because it really captures some of the philosophical reasons as to why we want to gravitate towards thinking that we're just born as blank slates, right? And they gave you some of those reasons in throughout history. It just, again, if you look at that pride issue, it just makes sense that if we don't learn it, then it deters us from assuming that we are limited based on biological reasons, right? And that's kind of, again, our pride is to say that we can pick things up as we go along because we're humans and we're the inferior species here, or not the inferior species here, right? So there are many reasons and philosophical reasons as to why people subscribe to people being blank slates, okay? Let's look at psychology's current perspectives. So when I say perspective, this is a question that I asked in the beginning of class, is what different perspectives contradict each other? A perspective is just a way to look at psychology, okay? Either from a phenomenological perspective or just as far as like an educated opinion. And we have several of them, okay? We look at psychology from a neuroscience, okay? And anybody that goes into neuroscience, I think we had a couple in here in this class that talked about going into neuropsychology. It's how the electrons flow through our brain and through our body to create behaviors or create impulses, or maybe in some ways even having thoughts in some ways, even though they're a little bit harder to do. So it was a very sciencey side of psychology. So for example, somebody that goes into neuroscience would be more interested in brain diseases, something that interrupts the flow of electrons that prohibits them from acting a certain way or behaving a certain way or even expressing emotions. All right, so that's more of the neuroscience. Evolutionary perspective. Oops, went away on me here. There we go. Evolutionary perspective looks at what traits, going back to the nature side of the nature versus nurture argument is what traits carried on through generations because they were more advantageous for that individual. So for example, say a person has some kind of genetic makeup or something within them that they don't have a strong desire to reproduce. Are they going to be able to pass that gene onto onto future generations, that trait?
Can you repeat the question, please?
If you have an organism, if you have either an organism or an individual that has a very low desire to reproduce, have sex and have children, do you think that they are going to be able to pass that trait, that low desire, on to another person, or onto another generation?
Probably, yes.
Well, would they, if they have a low desire to reproduce?
I mean, that's how they feel.
Okay. Well, in order to reproduce, they would have to reproduce, and if they have a low desire to do that,
And they
then
won't have any other generations to
right.
protect
So
and
that is that according to the evolutionary perspective, that's a characteristic that falls off. Okay. So for example, traditionally, people that were not able to sustain themselves, maybe they had a physical deformity back in the days of hunters and gatherers. If they had a gene that caused a physical deformity, that they weren't able to catch food or thrive for themselves, then that gene was not passed on because chances are they didn't live long enough to reproduce and carry on that gene. So that's what the evolutionary perspective is going to be. And we're going to touch upon that throughout this course, especially when we get into emotions and personality, and even getting into like neurotransmitters and the biological perspective. We'll touch upon evolutionary perspectives as well. Okay. Looking at behavior genetics, how much of our genes and our environment, I keep going, our environment influence our individual differences. So this is kind of looking at the biological perspective as well, but more geared towards behavior. So for example, some questions that a behavior genetics perspective would ask is, to what extent are psychological traits such as intelligence, personality, sexual orientation, and vulnerability to depression attributed to our genes or to our environment? Okay, so again, looking at nature versus nurture perspective. Psychodynamic, this is coined way back in the days of Freud, back towards the beginning of the 1900s, late of the 1800s. How behavior springs from unconscious drives and mostly deals in terms of sexual aggression, anger, how we manage anger, and how we deal with trauma. Very much a learned perspective with psychodynamic. Cognitive, how does our mind work as far as humans? How do we piece things together? We'll talk about the cognitive perspective here, I think in chapter 4 or 5, I believe. How do we learn to fear particular objects or situations, and how do we overcome those fears in order to get what we're trying to, whatever goals we're trying to meet? What are some of the ways that we handle obtaining our goals, right? And then lastly, we look at the social cultural perspective, which, how do we thrive in society? And when we get in towards a later chapter, I believe chapter 9, when we talk about social psychology, this will make a lot more sense. Okay, we learn as individuals, but we also recognize at a young age that we need others around us to survive, right? And that's very true when we're born. As humans, can we survive after being born without having any human interaction whatsoever? No, right? We're not like deer or horses who are born and within minutes they're able to stand on their legs and move around and forage, right? Humans take much longer, a year, 2 years before we can even walk and talk and communicate. So we learn earlier on that we really depend upon others for our survival. And that holds true to us as adults. And that's where we get into social social cultural perspectives, as we see people as they learn from their environments in hopes that they can communicate and gain something from the people around them. Okay. Within the profession of psychology, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, and I'll touch upon it now, there are many, many routes that you can go. From a basic research, build psychology's knowledge base through research and training. We have applied research. So basic research is basically asking questions, figuring out what questions we can ask to better move society. So for example, if you're in basic research, if you're basic research mode for marketing, you notice that there are certain trends that maybe certain genders or socioeconomic status are purchasing different types of cars, maybe luxury cars versus electric cars versus economy cars or SUVs or trucks or whatever. So asking those questions would be somebody that's engaged in this type of research. Applying research looks more at a practical problem, either in the industry or within mental health, and aims to make changes. This is where oftentimes we see experiments happening, and that's through applied research. And then the other big part of the profession that we see, and some of you have already alluded to, is the helping profession, which involves counseling and clinical treatment. Okay. Employment settings for psychologists, as you can see, a majority of them work for-profit organizations and self-employment. So maybe they are consultants for a research or marketing company. And then the 41%, the next majority there is works for universities, colleges, or medical schools. Okay. Then you got a small sliver there that works for federal government, and then an 8% works in state and local government. So this kind of gives you an idea of where people in the field of psychology tend to gravitate towards. Okay. Some scientific attitude and critical thinking, and what subfield, might somebody that goes into critical thinking, what does that mean in psychology? Okay, so when we think of critical thinking, we're questioning everything. We're questioning the validity. Like, for example, I share this with as an example for a lot of my students. A couple of years ago, when I was watching the Today Show, they had, I think it was Today Show, it was one of them, but they asked the question, or they didn't ask the question. They showed research that men who shave live longer. Sounds kind of cool, right? So if you shave, I mean, logic would dictate if you are a man who shaves, chances are you're going to live longer, right? It sounds flashy, makes sense. So me being the critical thinker that I am, I wanted to know, well, how did they get to that? What does that mean that men who shave live longer? Why would that be? Where do they get their data? So I took it upon myself to evaluate and look through the trajectory, and they showed that men who shave tend to exercise, tend to be in more meaningful relationship, tend to overall take care of themselves. Men who are in relationships also tend to be working, and again, looking at that self-care. So while shaving doesn't necessarily directly correlate to living longer, there are a lot of steps in between that. And that's really the essence that we want to do when we look at critical thinking. We want to examine assumptions. We want to discern hidden values, like taking care of themselves and exercising and maintaining relationships. And somebody that critical thinks also evaluates evidence and assesses the conclusion to make sure that it is sound. So when we're going through this course together, look at some of this, be skeptical of it, but be educated when you're skeptical. Just a lot of people tend to gravitate and say, well, that doesn't sound right to me. My grandma says blah, 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 blah. My Aunt Ethel always told me, make hay while the sun is shining, or something like that. While those are probably sage advice and inspiring in their own rights, they tend to be not evidentially, there's not a lot of evidence to really support what they're saying. So take it upon yourselves to look up the evidence that's supporting whatever it is that you either hear me say or something that you read in the book or whatnot. Okay, and come to it with humility. Remember when I said we as humans are two things. What are we?
Lazy and proud.
Lazy and proud. Okay, that's where kind of that humility comes into play. If somebody is humble and they understand that maybe I can be questioned, maybe I can be challenged, then that's really what we're talking about with humility. So if we're able to break away and think outside of our own pride, that's going to help you with critical thinking. Again, you may love Aunt Ethel and her great sage advice that she's given you, but being humble about it and just saying, well, maybe Aunt Ethel wasn't completely correct. And I apologize if anybody has an Aunt Ethel. I don't actually know that. I don't think Ethel has been used in the last 80 years. But anyway, if you are somebody that has an Aunt Ethel, I'm not picking on you, just to let you know. Okay. All right. So scientific method. Now, this is important when on Wednesday, I'll spend a little bit of time showing you how we look at some of the scholarly articles that we're going to be using, especially for your article reviews. All right. So how each one of these work, how each one of these scientific processes work is, especially in psychology, is we have a question. Okay. So I'll use it as an example. We know that lead, children that consume lead have oftentimes learning deficiencies, right? Or cognitive underdevelopment. We also know that in industrialized area, there tends to be higher lead in the water. Okay. So we have those two pieces of knowledge. Now, say you're in a community and you just want to know, you say, first of all, I think that we have a lot of children that have cognitive deficiencies here, and we're in an industrialized area. I want to know if there is some kind of truth to this, that maybe the kids here have higher deficiencies. So now we're starting to generate a question. And that's all the scientific method starts with, is asking a question given two or more known factors. Then based on that question, we're going to design a study. Okay, we're going to develop theories. We're going to use available theories to back up what we're pushing to explore. So for example, in this slide here, it says low self-esteem feeds depression. Okay, that's a great theory. How do we back that up? Where are we going to get that information? So out of that question, we're going to develop a hypothesis. Our hypothesis is basically your question, but just formed into a statement. So this theory, the hypothesis for this theory is going to be people with low self-esteem will score higher on a depression scale. Okay, that's our hypothesis. Now, it may be true or not true, which we'll get to later when we're either accepting or rejecting that hypothesis. But if we don't find anything, say we don't find people with low self-esteem score higher on the depression scale, that's okay. We still went through the research process, and we just showed that process of collecting data or that exact hypothesis or measurement didn't work for answering that question. That theory can still exist, but we know the way that we took to do that isn't a way to make that assertion, if that makes sense. Okay. Then after our hypothesis is developed, we research and we use observations, and we can either do that through administering tests or surveys, but we're going to look at evaluating self-esteem and depression and see if indeed one relates to the other through correlation. Okay. And then based on that research and those observations, we can probably make other guesses as to fine-tuning that. So for example, if we just did research within our community, we can break out of our small community and perhaps look at other communities to see if the same thing is also happening. also occurring. But this is really what's called empirical evidence, okay? And the other stage that I think that is missing in here is making sure that the scientific community is looking at that same data and looking at it for validity, making sure that it is testing what it's supposed to be testing and that it's reliable, that it's going to happen, that this same process would happen if somebody else replicated this study. So that's what we mean by empirical evidence and scholarly writing. I was asking what sources is it that we're aiming to look at? It's stuff that has gone through the empirical and scientific process for other people to look at it to make sure it's sound, okay? All right. With psychological research, we have descriptive methods that are used to observe and describe behavior. Now, for example, it examines one individual or social unit in depth and hope to find something that could be generalized for other people, okay? It's asking people to respond to in depth to a series of questions or report on their behavior and observe and recording behaviors as it occurs, okay? So descriptive methods, simply put, it's just describing what we're seeing, okay? It's not necessarily drawing conclusions on bigger pictures, although we can do that when we get into inferential methods. But description is just taking a set of data that we have accumulated, making some conclusions, making a little bit of assumptions to that, and then publishing those findings, okay? Some of the drawbacks to descriptives is like a case study, for example, may be too narrow to be of general use, okay? So for example, if I wanted to conduct a research in my small area, that might be great for describing small suburban areas of West Virginia or Pennsylvania or whatever. But if we try and apply those qualities or those descriptions to like more urban areas like Philadelphia or New York City, we're probably going to be off our mark, and what we're studying is not going to make a lot of sense for that setting. So that's one of the drawbacks to descriptive methods. People may not respond accurately to surveys, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later as to how to get better data. And naturalistic observations may not reveal all the factors that contribute to the observed behavior, okay? The last thing that I want to talk about today, and we'll pick up where we left off, are correlation studies, okay? So what is correlation? The answer is right here. Correlation studies show how factors are related. What does that mean? What is a correlation?
The connection between 2 points.
Okay, that was a very scientific explanation of that. It's within the word itself, it's a relationship, okay? So for example, if I use, let's see I'll use their example here. All right, so we could surmise that low self-esteem, using that example, could cause depression, right? We can make that assertion because somehow it makes sense to us that those two exist. Or we can say that depression causes low self-esteem. So as we see depression, the rate of depression goes up or mood comes down, we can also see that self-esteem goes down, okay? So one is happening while the other is happening as well. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that one is causing the other. We can't find that out until we start controlling one of those variables, but those two are our variables. Low self-esteem is a variable, self-esteem is a variable, I'm sorry, and mood is a variable, okay? So as one goes up, we see the other one go up. As one goes down, the other one goes down, okay? Again, we don't know what the cause is. So looking at alternatives, there might be an alternative explanation for that. In this case, maybe a distressing event or biological predisposition. Something is occurring within their brain chemistry that could be causing both low self-esteem and depression, okay? So just something to keep in mind until we test them. A correlation just explains the relationship. It doesn't explain cause of that relationship. So we wouldn't know what the relationship, we wouldn't know what the cause is until we've actually gone in and conducted an experiment to see what exactly could be the actual cause to that. So take that very cautiously. If you see something that says we detected a correlation between increase in ice cream sales on hot summer days, on sunny days, okay, there might be a relationship there, right? Sunny days might spawn people to go and purchase ice cream, but until we test those variables, we just don't know for sure. Within correlation, and I don't have a slide for this, and I apologize. So within correlation, we represent them as one, positive one, or negative one. 0, if you think of this on, maybe I do have I thought I had a slide on this. If you see like a continuum, on the far left of this, the continuum would be a negative 1.0, and then on the far right of it, it would be positive 1.0, and right in the middle would be 0. 0 means that there's no correlation whatsoever. There's no relationship. One could go up and the other one goes down or goes up, and it just doesn't match up. There's no consistency in one increasing over the other. But if you see a relationship, like for example, self-esteem goes up and mood goes up every time, what do you think? Is that going to be a positive or negative correlation?
Positive.
Positive correlation, because one's going up and the other one's going up. Let's look at THC use, cannabis use, and grade point averages. Okay, so as we see an individual increasing their cannabis use or marijuana use, what would we expect their GPA to do? What do you think?
Decline.
Right. So what we have here is cannabis use increasing, and we would think that a student's GPA would decrease. So that would be more, that's described as a negative correlation, because while one is doing one thing in one direction, the other one's doing the exact opposite in the other direction. Okay. So the higher we go up, the lower the GPA, but we do see that relationship. So that's what's described as a negative correlation. Okay. All right. So in reference to psychological research, I'm going to stop here for today, just because we are running up on time here. Are there any questions? Does anybody have any questions for me? Anything they want to add before we depart today?
Could you just go over what we need to complete as of like on our own work for this week?
Yep. So if you go into, oops, again, I'll just reiterate this. I know I showed everybody on last week. So if you go into D2L and go into content, and go under week 2. Again, it gives you a brief little interview, biological perspective. It'll talk about, it'll give us some resources or some videos or some links there you can use. So what you'll have do every week is going to be contained either within the discussion or the assessments. So if you go into week 3, it'll be the same thing, discussion or assessments. Okay. So for this week, you'll have pack back due within discussion. You just go in here and click on that. And then also for assessments, you have 2 things due this week. You have your assignment for nature versus nurture, and then you have your quiz that's due. Okay. And then for next week, same thing. You'll have your pack back due for the discussion, and then you'll also have your article review, which I'll talk about next week. Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Anything else?
Yeah. Excuse me, sir.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to ask about the textbook. You said it was important for us to get it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So if I want to get it, I go to how do I get it, please?
How do you get the textbook?
Mhm.
You can either get it through the bookstore, which is a Revel code. I'm actually going to stop recording right now. So